Hey, it's Alessandra from Geokite Birding Tours, and welcome to our first ID video. So the idea behind these videos is to give birders helpful tips and tricks to use in the field when identifying challenging groups of birds in the Great Lakes region. We wanted to start things off by focusing on gulls, because gulls are one of those groups where their ID causes a lot of birders confusion and suffering simply because there's so much variation. But the diverse plumage variation among and across species is one of the features that makes these birds so fascinating. We get a number of different species of large loris gulls here, and there are so many plumage variations, even among one species. So if you're sifting through large numbers of gulls, this can be quite overwhelming. We wanted to start off by focusing on one species, the herring gull, which is one of the gulls most commonly encountered in Ontario, along with ring-billed gull. Herring is similar to a lot of rare and uncommon species, so having a baseline for what herring gulls look like is a great start when focusing on gull ID. If you've ever gone out in search of gulls, this picture may be a fairly familiar sight. Massive numbers of herring gulls, hundreds or even thousands of birds in varying shades of gray, brown, black, and white, all in one location. Sifting through these birds can be quite challenging, especially when looking for similar species. In this photo, note the glaucous gull at the very top of the mound, larger than the nearby herrings, with all white plumage and a large pink bill tipped in black. This is one of the more obvious species found in herring gull flocks, but some may be a bit trickier. Before we get into herring gull identification, let's talk a bit about the different terms for feather tracks on birds' wings, because this will be helpful when learning more about gull ID. We often tend to stay away from more advanced terminology when talking about bird ID, because for a lot of species you can get away fine without it. This isn't the case with gulls though, because even having a basic handle on plumage terminology can be very helpful for accurate IDs. Let's take a minute to go over some of the terms used when talking about the wings of a gull, which is a good starting point for learning bird topography. First off, we have the remiges, also known as the flight feathers. As the name implies, these are the feathers that are primarily used by birds to fly. The flight feathers are made up of two feather groups, the primaries and the secondaries. The primaries are the 10 feathers that go from the outer tip of the wing into the bend where they meet the secondaries. Primaries are often discussed when birders talk about gull ID, and you may hear birders say things like, "Look at the brown edging on P5. The primaries are numbered starting with 1, which is closest to the body, counting outward to the tip of the wing, so the last feather at the end of the wing is P10. The one next to that, P9, and so on. It's often easiest when trying to note specific primaries to start at the end of the wing and then count inwards. The secondaries are next to the primaries, closer to the body. They are numbered starting from the primaries, counting inwards towards the body. The number of secondaries depends on the species, so some species have more and some have less. Specific secondary feathers aren't discussed very often in gull ID, though it's still important to know where they are on the bird. Above the primaries, there are the primary coverets, which protect the base of the primaries, and next to those and above the secondaries are the secondary coverets, which are usually referred to as the greater coverets. The last term we want to mention are the windows. Window may sound like a weird word to use when describing a bird, but on a gull it refers to the light-colored feathers near the end of the wing, usually on the first 5 or so primary feathers. Because of their light color, light shines through them easily, creating a window-like effect. This is a helpful field mark on a lot of species, especially herring gull. While we're on the subject of terminology, let's talk a little about aging gulls as well. Most large gulls, such as herring and great blackback, take 4 years to attain adult plumage, with medium gulls such as ring-billed taking 3 years, and small gulls like little gull taking 2 years. For now, let's look at some examples of the different age classes of herring gull. If you look at different field guides or online groups, you'll notice that birders describe gull ages in various ways. Some will simply say immature bird, while others will say first year, first cycle, or first basic. So which is correct? Well, technically they all are. They're just slightly different systems for talking about different plumages. For this video, we're going to use cycle. During a plumage cycle, a gull will molt all its body feathers twice and flight feathers once. So in 4 cycles, a herring gull will go from juvenile to adult plumage. For example, the bird in this photo is a first cycle herring gull in the winter, so it has already molted its body feathers for the first time and retained juvenile flight feathers. Let's have a look at the first example bird. This is a first cycle herring gull. This bird is fairly worn. You can see some of the outer primaries have nicks and tears in them, and some of the wing and tail feathers are quite faded. This photo was taken in the winter, so at this point the bird is around half a year old and has had these feathers for several months. Note how there's very obvious windows on the inner primaries, and the secondaries and outer primaries are a dark brown color. The primary coverts are a lighter shade of brown, and the greater coverts are very light. The bill is large and bicolored, with black near the end and a pink base. The tail is dark brown, and the rump is light with uneven dark barring. This is a fairly typical example of a first cycle bird, though this age is super variable and they can often exhibit much darker or lighter shades of brown. Here is a second cycle herring gull. This bird has a fairly delayed molt, so it's retaining a lot of its brown first cycle plumage on the body and wings. Note how the mantle, which is the back of the bird, is gray like adult herring gulls, and there are some gray feathers growing in on the upper wing. The window on the primaries is still quite obvious, but the secondaries and outer primaries are now black versus the brown of the previous first cycle birds. The tail now has a single white feather, but is otherwise black, and the rump is mainly white. The bill still has the pink and black look, and the head is brown and streaky. Moving on to a third cycle bird, you'll notice quite a difference. This bird is very adult-like in appearance, with no more brown remaining on the wings and tail, and almost entirely gray wings. You can still see some black markings on the primary coverts and secondaries though, and the end of the tail feathers still show quite a lot of black on them. The bill is a pale yellowish color with a faint black ring around the tip. This may cause some confusion with ring-billed gull, but note the large structure of the bill and the overall large, blocky proportions of the bird's head. The herring gull is also much more barrel-chested than slender-chested ring-billed gulls. It's worth noting, too, that while a lot of birds can be classified to age groups, some are much more challenging. For example, a second cycle bird may retain its plumage long into its third year of life, so even though it's 3 years old, it will look much more like a 2-year-old bird. I know that adds more confusion, but I feel like it's worth mentioning when discussing an aging gulls, because not every bird you'll encounter will fit into a neat box. If you look through thousands of herring gulls, you'll see lots of different plumage variations between first-year birds and adults. Although, by carefully observing the birds you find, you'll build up a baseline for what herring gulls look like, which will make the trickier individuals a bit less challenging. Finally, here is an adult herring gull, showing the classic field marks for the species. Gray upper wings with black outer primaries tipped in white, large white spots, which are called mirrors, on the outermost primaries, a white body, pink legs, and a yellow bill with a red spot on the lower mandible. Note how the wing looks a bit strange, with the secondaries much shorter than the primaries, creating a weird gap where they meet. This is because the secondaries are still growing in, so they appear a bit short. Adult herring gulls will vary slightly between different populations, but almost all adults will show the field marks that this bird has. In the winter, their heads get much more streaking on them, and in the summer, they have a clean, white-headed look. Now that we've talked about herring gulls for a bit, let's discuss one similar species that birders frequently face ID challenges when observing, the lesser blackback gull. Adult lesser blackbacks, like the bird in this picture, are fairly straightforward. They are a similar size to herring gulls, normally a bit smaller and thinner, with a black mantle, yellow legs, and a thinner yellow bill with a red spot on the lower mandible. The shade of the mantle can vary a lot, but even the light birds appear darker than herring gulls. The big challenge for a lesser blackback gull is the immature birds. Take this one for example, a first cycle lesser blackback gull. At a glance, it looks very similar to herring gulls, but there are some notable differences when you look a bit deeper. The primaries and secondaries of this bird are black, And note how there is barely any hint of a window on the inner primaries. The primary coverts are basically just as black, and the greater coverts are very dark brown. The patterning on the upper wing and mantle is much more crisp and defined than herring gulls, and the bill is thinner and all black, even towards the base. There is also a heavy dark shadow around the eye, a trait of many young lesser blackback gull. This bird also has a dark tail band and a white rump with dark chevrons. Takeaway points are the lack of windows on the wings, the dark flight feathers and coverts, as well as the all-dark bill. Bouncing back to another first cycle herring gull, note the large windows, the light brown coverts and the bicolored bill, as well as brown barring on the rump and much more diffuse and messy brown plumage on the upper wings and back. Now let's have a look at a less straightforward first cycle lesser blackback gull. This photo was taken in late May compared to the last example, which was in the fall. Much of this bird's plumage is very worn from months of wear and bleaching from the sun. Because of this, the greater coverts and primary coverts appear fairly light, and you could argue it looks like there's fairly strong windows. Note, however, the all-dark thin bill, the black outer tail band, and the bright white rump with black barring. Even though they're worn, the primary coverts are still close in color to the primary feathers. It's hard to judge from one photo, but in real life this bird has a very slim and long-winged impression, and was smaller than the herring gulls it was associating with. Feather wear and molt are some of the more challenging parts of gull ID, because they can often make a bird appear much paler than it looked in fresh plumage. That's when size and structure play a larger role. To end off the video, let's have a quiz. Pause for a minute and have a look at this bird, and try to figure out what it is. If you guessed herring gull, you're correct! This bird does have an all-black bill, which can definitely throw you off at first. Although only some first-cycle herring gulls have this feature, and bill color can vary significantly between individuals. When looking at the rest of the bird, note the light brown greater coverts, the undefined pattern on the upper wing and body feathers, and the brown messy rump. There's also a light window visible on the one wing. Even though the bill is dark, it still has the large heavy structure of a herring gull. Well, that's the end of our first Gull ID video. We hope you've enjoyed and learned some tricks to take with you to practice Gull ID in the field. There's definitely a lot more to discuss about gulls, but we'll save that for future videos just because there's so much to talk about. Good luck out there!